Chapter 1. The final waltz. The Harvest Ball in Chippingdean had, for the past 72 years, been a highly anticipated affair. Not because it was grand, or glittering, or particularly modern, but because it wasn't. It was, rather, a steadfast tradition in a world prone to inconvenient change. Held in the village hall, with its bunting-strung rafters and polished oak floor, the ball was as much about appearances as it was about dancing. Genteel rivalry flourished alongside claret punch. Old enmities were buried under layers of formal politeness, only to re-emerge a year later like crocuses in spring. Miss Marple, having attended more harvest balls in her lifetime than she cared to count, sat at a table near the rear wall, a cup of tepid tea in one hand and a bemused smile on her lips. She wasn't dancing tonight, she rarely did these days, but she observed with pleasure as the younger folks spun about the floor. Her eyes followed the elegant swirl of skirts and the occasional misstep with a knowing glance. It was, she often said, the pauses in dancing, those awkward hesitations, the glances exchanged between partners, that told you everything. Across the room, Mr. Howard Buxley, the recently returned son of the late Alderman Buxley, was twirling Miss Ruby Featherstone, the vicar's niece, with an enthusiasm more suited to a military drill than a foxtrot. Ruby, for her part, was flushed and laughing, her auburn hair pinned up in a defiant arrangement that looked ready to collapse at any moment. There were whispers, of course, about Howard's inheritance, his time abroad, his sudden return, and even more about the timing of his engagement to Ruby, a mere 3 months after he'd appeared back in Chippingdean with his father's signet ring and a noticeably thinner frame. Whispers were the village's second language. The music shifted from lively to lyrical, and couples rearranged themselves. The final waltz had begun. As Ruby and Howard made their way back onto the floor, something peculiar happened. Howard paused at the edge, winced slightly, and brought his hand to his chest. Miss Marple noticed it immediately, not the wince itself, but the way Ruby's expression changed. Not concern, not confusion, guilt, but the moment passed. Howard smiled, reassured her, and they joined the dance once more. It wasn't until the last note of the waltz faded and Howard stumbled suddenly backward that the room fell into a hush. He collapsed just shy of the refreshment table, one hand outstretched, eyes wide. For a moment no one moved. Then a cry rang out from Mrs. Lovelace, who had once fainted at the sight of a bruised banana. "He's dead!" she wailed, clutching her pearls as if they might offer comfort. It was Dr. Lambert, summoned from the punch bowl, who confirmed it minutes later. Howard Buxley was quite gone. "No pulse," he muttered, pulling back the man's collar. "Heart gave out, perhaps, though that would be rather unexpected in a man his age, not yet 40. "But he was dancing," someone said. "He was laughing," added another. "He was drinking," said Mrs. Grindle in a sharp tone. "That awful punch! Lord knows what's in it!" As murmurs swelled and pockets of alarm rippled through the gathering, Miss Marple remained where she was seated, her eyes calmly sweeping the room. She had seen enough harvest balls to recognize when something was off, not just the tragic collapse, but the reactions, the silences, the timing. She stood quietly and walked over to the refreshment table, now abandoned by all except a startled young constable named Hargreaves. "Don't touch anything just yet," she said gently, reaching for the silver ladle in the punch bowl with a handkerchief. The constable looked startled. "Miss Marple? Just an old woman who's seen a great many village halls, dear, and who knows that the key to a mystery often sits quietly, cooling beside the sandwiches." By the time Inspector Cray arrived from Basingstoke, the villagers had all but rearranged the facts to their liking. "Heart, definitely," said Mrs. Lovelace with authority. "Tragic condition. Runs in the family, no doubt. Or the strain of foreign business," speculated Mr. Peach. "Stressful life, I hear." Miss Marple, seated once more with her hands folded neatly in her lap, sipped her now cold tea and waited. Cray, a compact man with a well-trimmed moustache and a permanent air of professional scepticism, surveyed the body with measured disinterest, collapsed. "Mid-waltz, you say?" "End of it, actually," said Miss Marple helpfully. "Just as the music was stopping." Cray turned. "And you are Jane Marple? Ah, from St. Mary Mead, are you not?" "I am, visiting my cousin Margaret. She insisted I attend. I see." Cray jotted something down. "Did you notice anything unusual?" Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Only that Mr. Buxley seemed unwell just before he returned to the dance floor. He touched his chest, and his fiancée, Miss Featherstone, appeared momentarily alarmed." Cray nodded, but seemed uninterested in the subtle details. "Well, Dr. Lambert believes it may have been cardiac-related, but will need confirmation. I've requested a pathologist." Miss Marple stood and straightened her shawl. "Of course, Inspector, but I suspect you'll find something a bit less natural at the root of this tragedy." "And why is that?" Miss Marple glanced at the nearly untouched punch bowl. "Because the final waltz was not the only thing carefully choreographed this evening." She turned back toward the gathering crowd, toward Ruby Featherstone, who stood pale and trembling near the doorway, eyes flickering not to Howard's body, but to the glass he had been holding just before he collapsed. Chapter 2. The Village Reacts. By morning the shock of the harvest ball had shifted, quietly and efficiently, into full-blown village melodrama. The bunting hadn't even been taken down from the hall rafters before the local tongues had begun wagging like shutters in a gale. Miss Marple, ever an early riser, was already seated at the breakfast table in her cousin Margaret's cottage on Ashgrove Lane, spreading marmalade on her toast with the precision of someone who measured time in teaspoons and nuance. "Poor Ruby," Margaret was saying, pouring a second cup of tea. "Imagine! Her fiancé collapsing dead in the middle of a waltz, and the entire village watching. The scandal alone." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "People often fear scandal more than they fear grief." Margaret sighed. "Well, she didn't look like a grieving woman last night, did she? Pale as chalk, but not a tear to be seen. Not everyone cries in public," Miss Marple murmured. But Margaret, like the rest of Chippingdean, had already made her diagnosis. "I never quite liked Howard," she added after a pause. "Too smooth, too practised, and coming back from Brazil of all places with no explanation of what he'd been doing there for 5 years. It all seems a bit off." Miss Marple didn't disagree, though she found it curious how quickly people could become posthumously disagreeable. Howard Buxley had been the toast of the village a mere week ago. Dashing, well-dressed, a charitable donor to the new library, roof fund. But now suspicion clung to his memory like damp wool. Later that morning, Miss Marple strolled into the village proper. The butcher's queue was longer than usual, not due to any discount on lamb, but because it offered the best vantage point for whispered speculation. "She poisoned him, I'd wager," hissed Mrs. Canfield, a woman known for overcooked roasts and undercooked theories. "Young Ruby. Just look at her. Red hair always means temper." "She looked shocked to me," said Miss Jennings, the retired schoolmistress. "And he was holding his chest. It could have been his heart." "Mrs." Canfield sniffed. "Heart my foot. Mark me, something was in that punch." It was not long before the focus shifted, as it inevitably did, to the punch bowl itself. Miss Marple paid a polite visit to the church vestry, where Reverend Copley was reviewing donation tallies from the event. He greeted her with mild concern, and more than a touch of embarrassment. "I must say, Jane, I never imagined the harvest ball would end in anything more dramatic than a spilled trifle." "Nor I," said Miss Marple kindly, "but tragedy tends to ignore calendars." He offered her a seat and folded his hands. "I do hope this business with poor Howard doesn't ruin Ruby's name. People are quick to draw lines where none exist." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Do you think there's a line to be drawn?" The vicar hesitated. "Well, no, not really. But I did notice that they weren't exactly, how shall I say it, harmonious on the dance floor. He was more attentive to the widow Penhaligon than to his fiancée, if you ask me." "Ah," said Miss Marple with interest. "And did you observe how Miss Featherstone reacted?" "Cold," he said after a pause. "Unmoved. But that could be shock, couldn't it?" "Indeed." That afternoon brought further fuel to the village fire. Inspector Cray's preliminary report suggested that the post-mortem had revealed traces of digitalis, a toxic extract from foxglove, known to interfere with heart rhythm. Not enough to be conclusive, but enough to raise an eyebrow. And in Chipping Dean, raised eyebrows had the force of subpoenas. "It's a heart poison, I tell you," said Mrs. Grindle, gripping her knitting basket like a weapon. "We grow foxglove in the churchyard. Anyone could have got their hands on it." "Howard drank the punch," added Miss Jennings. "So did a dozen others. If it was poisoned, why didn't anyone else fall ill?" "A different glass, maybe," speculated young Lily Wright, peeking over her mother's shoulder in the bakery. "He could have had his poured separately, the implication, of course, being that someone had prepared his glass in advance." The suspect list grew longer by the hour. Some pointed fingers at Ruby, citing jealousy and pride. Others whispered about Mrs. Penhaligon, the widow with eyes like sharpened coal, known for speaking flu. Chapter 3. Early investigation. It was the sort of autumn morning that looked crisp from the window, but clung to the bones once one stepped outside. Mist clung low over the green and made silhouettes of chimney pots and bicycles. In Chipping Dean, most folks were still talking about the tragedy, but the tone had shifted. Fewer gasps, more theory. Miss Marple, wrapped in a dark tweed coat and a modest wool hat, had decided it was time to ask questions. Not overt ones, of course. In her experience, direct questions put people on guard. No, the real answers came when people thought they were speaking about something else entirely. She began at the place where everything had, quite literally, fallen apart, the village hall. It was unlocked, the caretaker, Mr. Pottles, still sweeping dried leaves from the front steps. He had been responsible for the lanterns and bunting during the ball, and was well known for two things: his deafness in one ear, and his tendency to linger just behind closed doors. "Morning, Mr. Pottles," Miss Marple said cheerily. He straightened and beamed. "Miss Marple, what brings you to the hall? Planning another parish poetry night?" "Not quite," she replied with a chuckle. "I was hoping you might help me piece together a little timeline. About the harvest ball, you were working the door, weren't you? From start to finish, didn't miss a beat." She smiled. "Then perhaps you saw Howard Buxley come in with Ruby." "Oh, yes, 7:15, just as the second tune started. They were late, everyone noticed, but dressed to the nines, both of them. Did he seem normal? Relaxed?" Mr. Pottles rubbed his chin. "Jumpy, I'd say. Looked over his shoulder twice before stepping in. Spilled half a glass of lemonade on his shoe before he even made it to the floor. And did anyone else arrive late?" He blinked. "Now that you mention it, yes, Mrs. Penhaligon, nearly 40 minutes after the first dance." "And where did she sit?" "Near the back, alone for most of the evening. She didn't dance until halfway through the programme." "Did she drink the punch?" "Oh no, she brought her own flask." Mr. Pottles chuckled. "Said she trusted her gin more than the vicar's recipe." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Did she speak to Mr. Buxley?" "At least twice. Once outside the side door, I saw them through the sash window when I went to fetch the bunting rope. Looked like a row, if you ask me." "Did she touch his glass at any point?" Mr. Pottles paused. "Can't say for sure, but she was hovering around the refreshment table when the music paused." Miss Marple gave a slow nod. "Thank you, Mr. Pottles. You've been very helpful." As she turned to leave, she noticed a small object tucked under the baseboard near the punch table, a crumpled napkin, slightly stained pink. She picked it up with a handkerchief and sniffed. Clove, perhaps. Something sharp. Definitely not punch. She folded it into a separate cloth and tucked it in her handbag. Her next stop was the Golden Spoon, the village's tea shop and gossip nerve centre. Miss Grindle, who ran it with a sense of imperial surveillance, welcomed Miss Marple with a raised eyebrow and a knowing smile. "Out sleuthing, are you?" she asked, pouring a delicate cup of Assam. "I'm merely catching up," Miss Marple replied, settling in. "So much happened so quickly." "Oh, and how? The poor boy, dead before dessert. And that girl, Ruby, still parading about like nothing happened. Do you think she had reason to dislike Mr. Buxley?" Miss Grindle snorted. "She wasn't the one he was meeting in the churchyard every other Thursday." Miss Marple blinked. "Oh, Mrs. Penhaligon. Caught them myself once while locking up the vestry. Looked like quite the intimate little chat." "And what of Mr. Trent?" Miss Marple asked. "Howard's friend?" Miss Grindle pursed her lips. "He's been scarce. Heard he's staying with his cousin in Bexhill. But you ask me, he was bitter. Grew up with Howard, watched him sweep in and take all the spotlight. Including, some say, a certain widow's attention." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "And the punch?" "Made by Reverend Copley himself, as always. But Mrs. Penhaligon, sniffed at it and said she'd rather drink rainwater. She always brings her flask, that one. Miss Marple noted that twice now someone had mentioned that flask. That afternoon, Miss Marple requested a word with Inspector Cray, who, to his credit, had already ordered lab results on the napkin she provided. Digitalis, he confirmed, waving the slip. And not from the garden variety either. Concentrated. Which suggests intent, said Miss Marple softly. But not just anyone would know the proper dosage. Cray frowned. We're still narrowing suspects. Ruby has motive, but no clear means. Penhaligon had access. Trent had time and left early. And now the entire village thinks the punch bowl is cursed. Clever, isn't it? Miss Marple mused. If one were to poison a single glass at a party, it would be safer to place suspicion on the entire bowl. Distract from the specificity of the crime. Cray's frown deepened. You think it was personal? I think, Miss Marple said, gently, that someone wanted to make certain that Howard Buxley never spoke again. Later that evening, while tending to her rosebush, Miss Marple received an unexpected visit. Mrs. Penhaligon stood at the gate, dressed in a dark coat, a silk scarf around her throat. "I hear you've been asking about me," she said calmly. "Only out of concern," Miss Marple replied. "You did have a conversation with Howard Buxley the night of the ball." "We had a disagreement," she said flatly. "He'd promised to settle something privately. He didn't." "What sort of settlement?" She hesitated. "He owed me money from a joint investment abroad. He said he'd pay me quietly before the end of the month. And instead, he got engaged to Ruby Featherstone." Mrs. Penhaligon's lips curled slightly. "A child playing dress-up?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "And if you had reason to believe he was lying again about the money, the locket, or the affair, what then?" A pause. "I would have handled it the same way I always do," she said, "with dignity and gin." That night, Miss Marple made a final entry in her notebook. 1 dance, 1 drink, 1 broken promise, and 1 person who knew exactly when the music would stop. Chapter 4. First Suspects. By the following morning, the whispering had grown loud enough to echo through closed doors. Inspector Cray, though a man who prided himself on maintaining neutrality, had spent enough time in small villages to recognize when the tide of gossip had turned into a tidal wave, and it was rapidly flooding toward Ruby Featherstone. She was summoned to the constable's office just after breakfast. Miss Marple, who had been tending to her ivy trellis nearby, noted the exact moment the news reached Mrs. Grindle, whose teacup froze halfway to her lips outside the golden spoon, and then to Mrs. Canfield, who turned a shade paler and immediately began muttering to her friend about knowing all along. Within an hour, the village had formed its verdict. Ruby had done it. After all, she had motive. Howard had been acting cold in the days before the ball, and there had been a rumour, never quite confirmed, that he'd spoken with his solicitor in Basingstoke about modifying his will. His estate, including his father's house and a modest trust, had been intended for his future wife. But a change to the wording, removing names, had reportedly been under discussion. "She must have heard," said Miss Jennings solemnly, over scones at midday. "A woman in love can endure many things, but not being cast aside for a richer widow. She poisoned him before he could change it," said young Lily Wright, with the wild energy of someone repeating gossip that sounded just plausible enough. But Miss Marple, who had known the difference between love and control, and between grief and guilt, was far from convinced. Inspector Cray, to his credit, approached the matter with relative caution. Ruby had not been arrested, but she had been formally interviewed, and her answers, according to Constable Rowntree, had been thin. She kept saying he was distant, but couldn't give any concrete examples. Rowntree explained to Miss Marple outside the bakery, sounding pleased to be included in the serious business of detection. She was nervous? Oh, extremely. Kept fidgeting, blinking like mad. Classic signs of deceit, I'd wager. Or fear, Miss Marple replied gently. Did she have access to the punch? She poured him a glass, he said. Confirmed by 3 people. But then again, so did 2 others over the course of the night. Miss Marple tilted her head. Did anyone see what happened to the glass afterward? Not particularly, Rowntree admitted. But Mrs. Canfield claims she saw Ruby hovering near the refreshment table 5 minutes before the waltz. Hovering is hardly damning, Miss Marple replied. Did she see her doing anything? No, he admitted. But between you and me, Inspector Cray is leaning toward issuing a formal charge, if nothing else arises. Miss Marple nodded, then said very quietly, It always worries me when we start preferring convenient suspects to correct ones. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to someone who had remained surprisingly quiet since the ball, Edgar Trent. He lived in a modest stone cottage at the edge of the village, surrounded by dry rose bushes and a suspiciously clean porch. He was a bachelor of the tidy sort. He opened the door with visible discomfort. Miss Marple, he said, I was just, preparing lunch. Nothing urgent, she said kindly. Only a chat. You were a dear friend of Mr. Buxley's, weren't you? He nodded stiffly. We grew up together, boys in knickers, playing cricket behind the old schoolhouse. And were you surprised when he returned? Trent paused. Yes, and no. He always said he'd come back eventually. He was that sort of man. Big talk, grand entrances. But you didn't attend the harvest ball for long? His fingers twitched. Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue. The morning rain had lifted by noon, leaving the cobbled square of Chipping Dean dappled in soft autumn light. It was on days like these, days when the village seemed too quiet, too content, that Miss Marple often felt the deeper things stirring just below the surface. And today, her instincts prickled. She had slept little. The conversations with Edgar Trent, the timeline of Howard's will revision, and the rising suspicion against Ruby had begun to form a shape. Not a complete picture, but a sketch with enough outline to feel disturbingly familiar. A tale of promises made and broken, yes, but also of someone watching, someone waiting for their moment. After a short stop at Myrtle's haberdashery to inquire about embroidery thread, and nothing more, though she did learn that Mrs. Penhaligon had purchased violet-coloured lace trim a week prior, Miss Marple returned to the village hall. The constable on duty, a young man named Davis, looked up as she arrived. Miss Marple, just a quick look, dear, she said sweetly. I'm working on a small report for the parish newsletter about floral arrangements and hall decor. He blinked, confused but unwilling to challenge her. Of course, just don't disturb, Anything Inspector Craze noted. Wouldn't dream of it, she said, already slipping past. Inside, the hall felt like a theatre after the curtain had dropped. The chairs were stacked. The bunting remained, limp and tired. On the floor where Howard Buxley had fallen, there was still a faint trace of chalk, now smudged, nearly swept away. She moved toward the refreshment table, where the punch bowl had once gleamed under fairy lights. On a whim, she crouched low and opened the side cupboard beneath the table. Inside, amid napkins and silver stirrers, sat a small velvet pouch, half buried under a tray of mismatched glasses. She drew it out carefully, heart fluttering. The pouch contained a small glass perfume vial with a silver screw top, embossed, faintly floral. It smelled faintly sweet but sharp, something herbal, something old. It was half full, and it was familiar. Miss Marple stood very still. She had once, many years ago, attended a luncheon where a woman had fallen ill from a tincture meant to steady the nerves. The tincture had contained digitalis, extracted by someone who didn't understand how rapidly dosage turned remedy to poison. This vial smelled nearly the same. She wrapped it in her handkerchief and tucked it into her handbag. By late afternoon, Miss Marple sat in her parlour, the fire newly lit and a pot of tea steeping, as she examined the vial under the small brass magnifier she kept for fine lacework. No label, no maker's mark, just the faded hint of something rubbed off the underside. She thought again of Mrs. Penhaligon's habit. Always her own flask, always her own scent, always a touch of the dramatic. But this vial didn't belong to a woman used to perfumes or handkerchiefs. No, this had the feel of something functional, medical, measured, and it wasn't hers, not if Miss Marple's memory served. At 6 o'clock, a knock came at the door. It was Dr. Lambert, fresh from surgery hours, and wrapped in a scarf too long for him. "I received your note," he said, eyes curious. "You wanted to speak about digitalis." She poured him a cup of tea and handed him the vial. "I found this beneath the refreshment table," she said. "Do you recognize it?" He examined it closely. His brow furrowed. "Well," he said, slowly, "this is a common style for medicinal tinctures. Not pharmacy-bought, but often used in field hospitals, or by travellers. Would a medical professional use one like this? Possibly. Someone who once worked in rougher conditions, or someone who had to treat themselves on the go." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Like someone who lived abroad for several years, in a remote region." Dr. Lambert nodded slowly. "Exactly." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Howard Buxley was in Brazil for 5 years. No one ever quite knew why. He returned thinner, tense, and strangely prepared for ailments that hadn't yet struck." Dr. Lambert set down the vial. "Are you suggesting he brought this with him?" "No," she said softly. "I'm suggesting someone else did." The next morning she returned to the constable's office and requested a word with Inspector Cray. "More developments?" he said, sounding wary but intrigued. "I believe the poison was administered not in the punch, but in a glass prepared in advance. One perhaps brought in a pouch, added with a precise dropper." She handed over the wrapped vial. Cray examined it with a furrowed brow. "And you're certain this wasn't rubies?" "Quite. She wouldn't have known how to use it, nor had reason to carry it with her." "Then who?" Miss Marple's voice was calm. Someone with a history of international travel. Someone used to working outside conventional medicine. Someone who had, perhaps, reason to believe that Howard Buxley was about to expose them. Expose? Howard had secrets, Inspector. And I suspect one of them involved Edgar Trent. Cray frowned. The friend? Not just a friend, she said. A former business partner. A man who had invested with Howard during his time abroad. A man who stood to lose everything if Howard spoke openly of what happened there. She handed him a folded note. "It's a telegram," she said. "I found it among Howard's discarded letters at the vicarage. Ruby hadn't read it. She didn't even know it existed. It was from Brazil, marked urgent, and it warned Howard that someone had followed his trail back home." Cray's expression darkened. "You think Trent was being blackmailed?" "No," Miss Marple said softly. "I think he was the blackmailer." By midday, Edgar Trent had been quietly summoned for questioning. He denied everything at first, but confronted with the telegram, the flask of tincture, and a travel record that placed him in Brazil at the same time as Howard, despite earlier claiming otherwise. His composure began to crack. "He was going to ruin me," he muttered, almost brokenly. "Said he'd confess to the whole operation. I told him to wait, that I'd settle things. But he was smug, smiling, just like he always was." "And so," Cray said coldly, "you poisoned him." "It was only a drop," Trent snapped. "A small dose, meant to scare him." Miss Marple, who had stood quietly by, looked at him and said not unkindly, "The thing about poisons, Mr. Trent, is that they don't care about intentions." Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. Inspector. Cray had delayed the formal arrest until morning. The evidence against Edgar Trent was damning, yes, but circumstantial in its composition. A half-full vial, a telegram, a web of associations from years abroad. Cray wanted it sewn tight, but in Chippingdean the news didn't wait for formalities. Dusk, everyone knew that Edgar Trent had been detained for further questioning, and that Miss Marple, of all people, had quietly handed over the final piece of evidence. "Trent," gasped Mrs. Canfield in the grocer's queue. "But I always thought him so polite. A bit dull, perhaps. But dull men don't go about poisoning people." "No, dear," replied Miss Jennings dryly. "They just go about arranging land transfers and pretending to be victims of migraines." Ruby, it seemed, had been publicly vindicated, but she did not reappear in the village square, nor return to the vicarage tea garden. According to Margaret, she hadn't been seen since the inspector's visit. "She's ashamed, I think," said Margaret softly to Miss Marple as they walked home from evening service. "Not of anything she did, but of everything she nearly believed. Of loving a man who, well, hid half his life behind a smile." Miss Marple gave a gentle hum of agreement. "Love is often blind, Margaret, but more dangerously it is deaf to the warnings of others, to instinct, to the small betrayals tucked inside compliments." Her cousin gave her a curious look. "You don't believe Trent acted alone, do you?" Miss Marple turned her eyes to the distant glow of the village hall roofline. "I believe Howard Buxley kept more than one secret, and secrets are rarely kept by one person only." The following morning, Inspector Cray arrived at Miss Marple's cottage just after 9 o'clock. He looked tired, as though a restless night had crept into his collar. "I've spoken to the Crown Prosecution Office," he said, accepting a cup of tea. "They agree we have enough to bring formal charges against Trent, but it won't be easy." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "It rarely is, especially when pride clouds reason." Cray looked up. "You think he'll deny it again?" "I think he'll twist it until he believes it himself." Cray hesitated. "There's something else," he added after a pause. "Something odd." "Oh?" "We searched Trent's cottage again. We found letters, correspondence between him and Howard, some of it quite old. They were never friends, not really." "What were they then?" she asked. Cray tapped the envelope on the table. "Business partners, investors, and on one occasion co-conspirators in a mining venture in Pará State, South America." Miss Marple took the letter gently. "And was it legal?" Cray gave her a tight smile. "Barely. But more than that, we found receipts. Large deposits made to Trent under the name Sylvana Export and Holdings, registered to Mrs. Dorothea Penhaligon." Miss Marple's teacup paused in mid-air. "Oh my," she said softly. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to the widow herself. Mrs. Penhaligon lived in a small stone house with a well-trimmed boxwood hedge and heavy green curtains that never seemed to move. She answered the door in deep plum silk and a cigarette holder, poised at an angle that made her seem part sculpture. "I wondered when you'd call," she said, not unkindly. "The village needs someone to blame, after all." "I believe we've already found our man," Miss Marple replied sweetly. "Yes." Mrs. Penhaligon's smile did not reach her eyes. "Edgar, the faithful shadow." They moved into the drawing-room where a crystal decanter. Chapter 7. Another Twisted was a particularly still evening in Chipping Dean. The sort of evening where sound travels too easily, where footsteps echo a fraction longer than expected, and teacups seem to clink louder against saucers. Miss Marple always found such quiet unnerving, not because of the piece itself, but because it usually preceded some new disturbance. The village, though shaken, had begun to right itself. Edgar Trent was in custody, and Mrs. Penhaligon's name, though not yet in the papers, had been quietly added to the list of persons under official scrutiny. There was talk of criminal conspiracy, international fraud, and potential extraditions, terms that didn't often find their way into the vocabulary of a place where scandal usually meant mismatched tablecloths at a church fete. Yet Miss Marple remained unsatisfied. It was not that she doubted Edgar Trent's guilt, nor even that of Mrs. Penhaligon. Their motives were clear, their means undeniable. But something else had begun to nudge at the edges of her mind, something unaccounted for. It was Ruby Featherstone, and the photograph. The picture, still resting beside Miss Marple's fireplace, remained the most peculiar piece of all. It depicted Howard, Ruby, and Trent together in mid-July. Howard's arms slung around them both in a jubilant pose, all three smiling in a scene that reeked of youthful optimism. But the handwriting on the back, "To New Beginnings," was unmistakably Ruby's. Why would she write that? Had she truly believed the three of them were about to embark on some shared future? And why had Howard kept the photo in his coat pocket at the ball? It didn't make sense, unless it wasn't Howard's photo at all, unless he hadn't known it was there. Late that evening, Miss Marple paid another visit to the vicarage. Ruby was at home. Margaret had seen her return quietly 2 days before, but she had refused callers, and even Reverend Copley himself had said little beyond, "She needs time." But Miss Marple knew that the difference between time to heal and time to fester was a matter of choice. She knocked once, the door opened slowly. Ruby stood pale in the doorway, her hair pinned loosely, her eyes shadowed. "I knew you'd come," she said softly. Miss Marple smiled. "Might I trouble you for 10 minutes?" Ruby stepped aside without answering. The drawing room was dim, a single lamp flickering on the sideboard. A teacup sat abandoned on the table, its contents long gone cold. Miss Marple sat and opened her handbag. "I found this photograph near the piano in the village hall," she said, handing it over. "It appears to be from July." Ruby's hand trembled slightly as she accepted it. She said nothing. "You wrote the message on the back," Miss Marple continued. "It's your handwriting. I checked it against your note to the vicar about the altar flowers." Still, Ruby didn't speak. "I imagine you gave it to Howard," Miss Marple said gently. "A gesture, a hope. But he didn't keep it in a drawer, did he? He kept it on him." Finally, Ruby looked up. Her voice was very low. "I put it in his pocket, the night of the ball." Miss Marple nodded. "Why?" Ruby swallowed. "Because I needed him to remember how it began, how we believed it would be the three of us, me, Howard, and Edgar. A little dream we built over picnic lunches and wine that went to our heads. But it changed." "Yes," she whispered. "Howard changed. When he returned from Brazil, he wasn't the man I'd fallen in love with. He was cold, careful, as though he was waiting for the world to punish him. And yet you agreed to marry him." "I had to," she said, a tear slipping down her cheek, "because if I didn't, it would all fall apart. Edgar needed the facade to keep his stake. Dorothea, Mrs. Penhaligon, needed the engagement to keep the investments quiet. And I needed something to believe in." Miss Marple's gaze didn't falter. "But you weren't the victim, were you, Ruby?" The girl froze. "You weren't just dragged into their plans. You knew. Perhaps not all the details, but enough. Enough to realize you were the perfect shield." Miss Marple leaned forward gently. "You brought the photo to the ball not as a token of love, but as a warning, because you knew Howard was going to pull out. You knew Edgar might panic. And you wanted Howard to remember you weren't some helpless girl in a borrowed dress." Ruby's voice cracked. "I just wanted him to choose me, to choose us, not his guilt, not his escape route." Miss Marple sat back. "And when he didn't, when he whispered to Edgar, when he made it clear he was done playing pretend, you realized it would all collapse." Ruby closed her eyes. "I didn't poison him." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "you didn't. But you knew Edgar would do something." A long silence. Ruby opened her eyes. "He told me he had a plan. I thought he meant Howard's drink would be spiked, just enough to make him collapse. Be embarrassed, change his mind. Edgar always wanted Howard to need him. And you let it happen." Ruby nodded once. "Yes, I let it happen." Miss Marple left the vicarage just before midnight. The stars above were unusually clear, the moon sharp and unsentimental. She walked slowly, cane tapping the stone path, heart heavier than before. It had been a tragedy, not just of death, but of hope, of three people bound together by ambition, love, and fear, and each had betrayed the other. In the morning, she would tell Inspector Cray everything: Ruby's confession, her complicity, her silence, whether it led to prosecution or pity was no longer in Miss Marple's hands. Some truths, she reflected, don't seek justice. They simply refuse to remain hidden. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test. Miss Marple had always believed that the truest confessions were never spoken. They were revealed in pauses, deflections, and the strange, flickering inconsistencies that crept into a person's voice when they believed the matter was behind them. So it was not the inspector she called upon next, nor even Ruby Featherstone again. It was Mrs. Dorothea Penhaligon. The widow had been quietly released pending further investigation, her solicitors having insisted that she had never touched the glass, never handled the punch, and never issued a threat. Her flask, so often her signature accessory, had notably contained nothing but diluted gin, as Cray's team had confirmed. But Miss Marple wasn't interested in the gin. She was interested in the way Mrs. Penhaligon watched people, and in what she might do when she thought the game was over. "I wonder if I might call upon you," Miss Marple had written in her note. "I have something that may belong to you." The reply came swiftly. 3 o'clock. Don't bring the constable. When Miss Marple arrived at the stone cottage, Mrs. Penhaligon was dressed in muted black, not the theatrical mourning of some widows, but a trim and practical ensemble that spoke of confidence sharpened by decades of control. Her hands were bare, no rings, no bangles, just a thin line of pearls at her throat and an unreadable expression in her eyes. "You said you had something for me?" she asked, ushering Miss Marple inside. "Yes," Miss Marple said, settling slowly into the stiff-backed armchair by the fire. "Something I found tucked behind the hymn books at the parish vestry." She reached into her bag and withdrew a small folded sheet of paper, aged and creased. Mrs. Penhaligon took it with a flicker of surprise. It was a letter, one that Miss Marple had discovered while returning borrowed prayer cards to Reverend Copley's desk earlier that day. The envelope was unmarked, the handwriting unfamiliar at first glance, but the signature was damning. It was a note from Howard Buxley, dated 2 days before the Baldaldi. "I've done what I can, but I won't be used. I'm going to tell Ruby. I'm sorry, but it's over. You were right. Some things never change. I just can't be part of them any longer." Mrs. Penhaligon read it once, folded it again, then returned it to the table beside her brandy decanter. She did not deny it, which was, of course, a confession in its own way. Miss Marple's tone remained conversational. "You loved him." Mrs. Penhaligon gave a small wry smile. "Loved him? No, I built him." "Even so," Miss Marple said, "you were frightened when he threatened to unravel what you had created." "I was angry," the widow corrected, "not frightened. Howard always fancied himself a noble man. But nobility doesn't survive long in the business of digging secrets out of soil and selling them to the highest bidder. You advised Edgar not to act. I did, and then he did exactly what men always do when their pride is poked. He acted like a hero until the consequences landed on my shoulders." Miss Marple stirred her tea gently, though it was untouched. Then why the telegram? She asked quietly. Mrs. Penhaligon blinked. What telegram? Miss Marple didn't hesitate. The one Howard received from your contact in Brazil. The one warning him someone had traced the financial misdeeds back to you both. For a moment, Mrs. Penhaligon didn't move. Then, almost too late, she smiled. Ah, she said, that telegram. It was all Miss Marple needed. When Miss Marple met with Inspector Cray later that evening, she handed him the letter from the vestry and her notes on the widow's slip. She claimed knowledge of a telegram I never told her existed. Cray whistled through his teeth. She may not have poured the poison, Miss Marple said, but she's guilty of pushing Edgar to the edge, of using Ruby as a buffer, of allowing things to spiral, believing herself too clever to be caught. Hill nodded. We'll bring her back in. And Ruby, Miss Marple hesitated. She's guilty too, but not of murder, of omission, of silence, of loving a man who lied to her, and using that love to shield herself from the truth. Cray scribbled something in his notebook. Will it hold in court? No, Miss Marple said, almost with a sigh. But Justice, Inspector, does not always wear a robe and carry a gavel. Sometimes it arrives quietly. Chapter 9. The reveal Miss Marple had always believed that the truth, like a persistent weed, finds its way to the surface, eventually. All it requires is time, light, and someone with the patience to spot it among the roses. On a chilly Thursday afternoon, she arranged a small gathering at the church meeting room, just off the vestry, under the pretence of assisting Reverend Copley with a memorial planning committee. It was an old trick, inviting people under one pretext only to gently turn the conversation toward deeper matters. She did not intend drama. She never did. But as she looked around the worn wooden table at the gathered faces, she knew the time had come for the truth to be laid bare. Inspector Cray was there, notebook in hand, Ruby Featherstone, silent and pale. Constable Rowntree, standing awkwardly by the wall. Reverend Copley, kindly but anxious. And finally, escorted in at the last minute by Cray himself, Edgar Trent, his face tight with exhaustion. Miss Marple rose, slowly but surely, and addressed the room with a soft voice that somehow filled every corner. Before this meeting ends, she said, I would like to speak, not as a detective, for I am none, but as a woman who has lived long enough to know that people rarely commit great wrongs out of malice alone. They do so out of fear, pride, and most often shame. No one interrupted. She began to pace slowly. When Howard Buxley returned to Chipping Dean, he brought with him more than a suitcase and a charming smile. He brought secrets and guilt and a desire to sever himself from the past. Her eyes turned briefly to Edgar. But severing oneself from others is never clean, especially when those others hold the leash of your reputation. She turned to Ruby. He had promised you love, perhaps even believed it once, but you too knew what he was carrying. You placed the photograph in his pocket, one of 3 friends once united by ambition. You hoped to remind him of what he owed. Ruby looked away, trembling. Miss Marple continued, but Howard had already made his choice. He intended to leave, not only the business, but you. He had arranged for a solicitor to amend his will the following week. He planned to expose a trail of misused funds, some tied to investments under false names. She turned to Edgar. "Which is why, Mr. Trent, you brought the vial." Edgar's knuckles whitened. Miss Marple didn't raise her voice. "You had carried it before, hadn't you? In Brazil. For emergencies. A tincture of digitalis. You knew the dosage that could mimic a weak heart. You thought a dramatic fainting spell might remind Howard who really held his strings." Edgar finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "I didn't mean for him to die. I only wanted to stop him, to slow him down." "But you used too much," Miss Marple said gently, "or his heart was weaker than you knew. Either way, it was you who added the drop to the glass before returning it to the refreshment table." A tense silence followed. Then Miss Marple turned to the others. But Edgar wasn't alone. He was encouraged, pushed, by a woman who knew how to guide others without appearing to lead. Though Mrs. Penhaligon was not present, her name hung in the room like perfume. Mrs. Penhaligon benefited from the silence. She had business interests hidden behind the polished name of Sylvana Holdings. Holdings that, if exposed, would have implicated her in more than social scandal. Cray nodded slowly. "We have the letters and the wire transfers. She'll be charged accordingly." Miss Marple folded her hands. But there was one more player. One who did not pour poison. One who did not fund smuggling. But one who knew, who overheard enough, saw enough to realize something was going to happen, and said nothing. She looked once more at Ruby. "You let it happen," she said softly. "You hoped Howard would be frightened, that he'd choose safety. Choose you. You didn't expect him to fall, but when he did, you stood still, because in your heart you'd already decided he deserved it." Tears slid down Ruby's cheeks. "I loved him," she whispered. "I know," Miss Marple said, "and that was the tragedy. You loved the version of him that never really existed." Reverend Copley, who had remained silent throughout, now rose and placed a hand on Ruby's shoulder. "We all fall short," he said quietly. "What matters now is what we do with the truth." Inspector Cray closed his notebook. "Charges will be issued," he said, not unkindly. "But I imagine some, like Miss Featherstone's role, will be weighed against intent." Edgar Trent said nothing. He looked not angry nor bitter, but emptied. The meeting ended without ceremony. Outside, the wind had picked up, scattering brittle leaves across the church path. Miss Marple stepped into the chill, her coat tugging at her frame. As she reached the gate, Ruby caught up beside her. "Thank you," Ruby said. Miss Marple nodded. "For what?" "For not turning this into a spectacle." Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "My dear," she said, "murder may be dramatic, but understanding is always quieter and more lasting." They parted ways at the corner, and the village, though still rustling with unease, began its slow return to order. Chapter 10. Aftermath. It was the kind of cold that crept in politely. The early signs of winter brushing the stone cottages of Chipping Dean, with frost around the gutters and chimney stacks. In the weeks following the harvest ball, the village had begun to exhale, but the breath still came out in visible puffs, hesitant, fragile. Edgar Trent was no longer in the village. He had been escorted to Basingstoke by the authorities, pending formal charges. Word had it he had signed a full confession, one marked by trembling hands and no request for leniency. Some said he'd aged 10 years in a fortnight. Others said he looked relieved. Mrs. Penhaligon, meanwhile, had disappeared almost as quickly as she had reappeared. Her cottage stood shuttered, her rose trellises left untended. A notice appeared in the window a week later. Let by private arrangement, the solicitor had declined to say more. And Ruby Featherstone? She did not leave with sirens or scandal. She left quietly, bags packed by her aunt, a long wool coat drawn close around her. Margaret told Miss Marple that Ruby had kissed the vicar's cheek at the station and thanked him without a trace of irony. "I think she'll be all right," Margaret had said. Eventually. Miss Marple had nodded, because some wounds, she knew, did not require stitching. They simply needed time and a place far enough away from where the hurt had begun. The village hall remained closed for the rest of the season. Officially, it was due to a planned repainting and structural survey. Timely refurbishment, the parish council had called it. But everyone knew why. No one wanted to dance on the same floor where Howard Buxley had died. There was talk of replacing the wooden planks, of hanging new bunting, of planning a spring ball to wash the memory away. But Miss Marple, ever sceptical of such symbolic scrubbing, knew that memory was not so easily rinsed. Howard's legacy would remain, not in the floorboards, but in the eyes of those who had watched him fall, and in the slow dawning realization that no one really knew who he had been. One afternoon in late October, Miss Marple visited Reverend Copley at the vicarage. The drawing-room smelled of applewood and old leather. Tea had been poured, and the fire hummed gently. "You saw more clearly than any of us," the Reverend said, breaking a thoughtful silence. "It's a gift." "No," Miss Marple replied with her usual softness. "Just an old habit of watching. People are always telling you the truth if you give them enough time." He sipped his tea. "Do you think Ruby will come back one day?" "No," she said. "But I think she'll think of this place more often than she expects to. She'll carry it, like a pressed flower, in a forgotten book, unfolded only when she least wants to see it." Copley nodded. Did she love him, do you think? Miss Marple looked into her teacup. She loved the version of him he allowed her to see, the part that wanted redemption. But Howard Buxley belonged to too many people, to Edgar, to Dorothea, to an identity he tried to shed but never quite escaped. She set her cup down gently. He was a man torn between guilt and self-preservation, and in the end he chose neither. The next day Miss Marple went walking through the churchyard alone. The air was brisk, and the sky held a soft pewter hue that promised early dusk. Her footsteps were slow, her cane steady against the gravel path. She stopped before Howard's modest gravestone, recently added near his parents', the soil still settling. There was no inscription beyond the standard, no beloved son, no devoted fiancé, just his name, his dates, Howard Percival Buxley, 1899-1937A, man remembered not for how he lived, but for how he died. Miss Marple bent slightly and set a single sprig of rosemary beside the stone. "For remembrance," she said quietly. Then, straightening, she turned her gaze to the horizon. Later that evening, back at her cousin's cottage, Miss Marple sat by the hearth, her knitting basket at her feet, and a small journal opened in her lap. It was her habit after every case, though she never called them that aloud, to record her thoughts in tidy script. She dipped her pen in ink and began to write. Chipping Dean, Harvest Ball, Death by Digitalis. Guilt shared among three: Edgar Trent, executor and coward; Dorothea Penhaligon, manipulator and shadow puppeteer; Ruby Featherstone, silent accomplice of the heart truth, delayed but not denied. Lesson: a lie can be danced around only so long before the music stops. She closed the book softly, then turned to the fire, watching the embers crackle and fall into one another, red to grey, light to ash. And in the silence, she whispered something that no one else would ever hear. Even in a place as quiet as this, she said, secrets know how to speak.